Gentleman yields. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Dr. Joyce, for 5 minutes for his questions.
Thank you, Chairman Palmer and Ranking Member Tonko, for holding this important hearing, and to our panel for being here today to testify. CERCLA was established to hold polluters liable for the cleanup of chemical contamination that they caused. This polluter pays liability framework is helpful in many instances where there is a need for expensive environmental cleanups so that the party that generated or released a hazardous substance can be held responsible for the associated costs. However, the liability established by CERCLA does not stop with the polluters. Under the statute's liability framework, any person who has had incurred costs related to the remediation of hazardous substances can file suit against not just polluters, but so-called passive receivers. These passive receivers are not involved in the initial generation or discharge of hazardous chemicals, but might receive water, soil, or other materials containing such substances. Given how common the use of PFAS is, the 2024 final rule designating 2 PFAS chemistries as hazardous substances creates a system where many passive receivers will be drawn into costly legal proceedings for contamination that they bear little or absolutely no responsibility for having created. I would like to focus on some of the defenses to CERCLA liability outlined in the statute and whether these are sufficient to protect the passive receivers in the context of these 2 aforementioned PFAS designations. Mr. Falba, I want to talk first about the bona fide prospective purchaser defense. A party that purchases land that they know or have reason to know is contaminated can invoke this defense if they meet certain statutory criteria and ongoing obligations. Would you please give a brief overview of the statutory defense and how it works?
Yes, certainly. So the bona fide prospective purchaser defense is a fairly recent innovation for CERCLA. It was included in the Brownfield Amendments of 2002. So, as CERCLA has, we've lived with this for 45 years, CERCLA has evolved, and the BFPP is one of the new defenses that was inserted into CERCLA. So under the BFPP, a owner or a new buyer of property can do an investigation, a phase 1 environmental site assessment, identify contamination, but yet then have a shield for CERCLA liability if certain criteria are met. One is to do that all appropriate inquiry, which is usually a phase 1 environmental site assessment. Then, though, you have to, when you get the property, you have to have continuing obligations. You can't just sit there. If there's a problem, if there's a release, you actually have to address that. So this defense can be lost. It's also self-certifying, which means EPA is not involved. So a BFPP or a would-be BFPP doesn't actually know they have maintained that defense until it's tested in litigation. So because EPA is not involved and you don't get a certificate like with a state closure, it has a lot of uncertainty to it. And
can you outline
Yes.
any needed improvements for this defense, such as EPA providing more certainty to the parties so that they can assert this defense? And finally, in your opinion, are statutory changes needed?
Yes, I think there is an avenue for strengthening the BFPP. The reason it was deemed self-certifying in the beginning was to try to get EPA out of the way so you didn't have to wait for EPA to oversee a site. The problem with that is you have no regulatory authority that sort of blesses the cleanup. There's nobody to say, yes, you've done a good job. That's what happens on the state voluntary cleanup programs. As far as the statutory fix, I think there should be a passive receiver exemption built into CERCLA, very narrowly tailored for passive receivers, among them owners of real estate that did not.
Thank you. I think we needed that clarification today. Mrs. Bodine, you noted in your written testimony CERCLA liability exclusions for innocent landowners where contamination is caused by a third party and contiguous property owners where contamination migrates from one source to an adjacent property. However, you noted that the burden is on the landowner to prove that it is eligible for these defenses, and they often incur significant cost in that process. Will these defenses be difficult to invoke in the context of PFAS?
I would say yes, because of what has been discussed here today, the fact that you don't know where the PFAS is coming from.
But given your experience of drafting CERCLA legislation and implementing it at the EPA, do you have any advice for us in Congress for considering whether to modify existing defenses or update new ones?
You could do both. On the modifying existing, you could deal with the burden of proof issue. Is it a defense where somebody raising the defense has the burden to show that they're eligible? Or is it an element of liability saying that whoever's bringing the lawsuit has to show that you fall within, that you are indeed liable? So that's existing. On the new ones, yes, there are, I mentioned the equitable factors. I mean, we've talked here today, people who didn't intentionally use PFAS are still being swept in. That concept of intentional use, I think it came up, maybe Ms. Donovan brought it up. I mean, there are states that are issuing bans on use of PFAS, and they have defined intentional use.
My time has expired. I thank you. I will submit additional questions for review. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.